One of the most bewitching aspects of film is the way that movies can hijack your body and elicit different responses even though your conscious mind is aware that the stimulus you're being presented is not real. Cinema can break down the concept of reality, bypass logic, and hit us right in the lizard brain. And one of the most utilized tools for this in film is music. What's up, Notes and Chords? I'm Jaden. Today I want to talk about horror music. Horror, I think, more than almost any other genre, can really exemplify how music can make or break a film. Because in horror, more than in any other genre, the music has a role to play. It doesn't just have to be creepy. It needs to be able to scare you. It has to take the mundane things happening on the screen and give them an air of creepiness, and it has to take the creepy things that are happening on the screen and give them the context of absolute mind-baffling terror. It has to be a finely tailored conglomerate of dysphoric sounds in order to really pull us out of our concept of reality and affect us on a more physical level. And the job is even harder if the score is intended to be haunting, to follow the viewer after the film itself has ended. Part 1. A brief history of horror music. Nowadays, cinema has a bit of a shorthand, ways to convey complex and intense ideas through simplistic imagery or sound profiles. For example, if you're watching a movie or TV show and it shows the outside of a building, and then a few moments later it shows you a door, because your brain's been fed a steady diet of this cinema shorthand, you have the capacity to make assumptions and understand visual media before you in a way that doesn't require conscious interpretation. It's a language that's been developed over decades of conditioning. Film after film after film and TV shows, movies, all of that has constantly been inputting information into your brain that leads you to be able to make these assumptions about what you're watching. But that wasn't always the case. If we go back to the early films, I'm talking like the original Nosferatu, Vampire, those films, you can see that there is a disconnect. There's almost an inherent discordance in the visual imagery that you're getting because at this point in time, the concept of cinema was still very, very new and hadn't been fully integrated the way it has nowadays. So filmmakers didn't have pre-existing media that they could work off of to create this dialogue. They were going off their own interpretations and what they tried to convey. Modern film utilizes homage almost constantly in ways that you aren't going to overtly notice. The use of similar techniques and visuals to other movies to evoke the same sensations that that movie evoked. But back then this wasn't possible. There were no earlier movies that people could really elicit for these sorts of things. So they had to rely on what they did have. Music. See, while these earlier movies didn't have cinematic shorthand to work off and convey complicated themes, they did have orchestral music, which came with its own set of shorthand and language that people understood. Certain tones and pitches that meant certain things to the human mind that had already been installed in the current generation at that point in time. So these early silent films relied on pre-existing orchestral music to get across the complicated ideas and themes that couldn't really be evoked without sound. Big, dramatic, romantic era sounds were used to convey these complex, intense human experiences that couldn't otherwise be displayed on a silent screen. Because of this, there was no subtlety in film, and we see how this adapted when we watch older movies, and by a modern perspective, the acting seems almost goofy, but you have to understand that there wasn't subtlety in film because things couldn't be conveyed if they were done subtly. Big, important moments were driven home by big, important sounds. Then 1933 rolls around. The Great Depression is at its worst, Roosevelt is president, and the first drive-in theaters open, just in time for the release of the first King Kong. And King Kong, believe it or not, broke the concept of that point of what film could really be. You see, King Kong was the first film to incorporate an original score. The music in it was written for it. And that concept paved the way for what music in movies could be and what it could actually do. And almost all of the shorthand you're accustomed to in cinema can be directly traced back to King Kong. For example, the concept of leitmotifs, which is when a sound or melody is used to convey a specific character or storyline or an element of something, you have King Kong to thank for incorporating that into film. Or perhaps more recognizable, sync scoring, also known as Mickey Mousing, where the music is written to go hand in hand with the actual physical motions of the character. That is also a King Kong thing. King Kong set the stage for what horror movie music sounded like all the way up until Psycho. Psycho's score, while still notorious, granted horror fans both the introduction of a mainstream jump scare and the use of horror stings to make that work. To a post-World War II world, the big, lush, romantic gestures of the musicscape that had predominated film up until this point were now undesirable, and that genre started to take a backseat to a more haunting and jarring experimental audio experience.
Faster! Hang on, darling. Close your eyes and hang on tight.
As technology advanced, the general audience and the music scene both got more and more interested in synth and the introduction of warped sound, which created an entirely new landscape for film to work off of, all the way up until the 1990s romanticism blockbuster movement. Odds are you've seen a 1990s film, be it a horror film or more likely a more mainstream, big-budget blockbuster, and along with it came the crescendos and orchestral big housing that we all know and love from the ridiculous 90s movies. Think Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. And hand in hand with this came a greater emphasis on the integration of pop music into film. From a modern perspective, though, horror movie music relies more and more on abstract sound and discomfort, to a point where big orchestral sounds sound nothing short of cheesy. The more blockbuster you put into a horror soundtrack, the harder it is to get into that suspension of disbelief. Whereas at the beginning, music would be tacked onto horror films, already existing and understood pieces sort of hobbled together with visual media to create horror soundtracks. Nowadays, the horror music score is almost a setting in and of itself. A good horror score is a compiling of auditory elements meant not only to drive the point of the film home, but to drive the viewers. Take, for example, It Follows, a movie that I am convinced is actually very, very, very bad, but has hands down the most effective horror movie score I have ever heard. No, I'm serious. Next time you try to watch It Follows, mute the music. Nothing happens. It's not good, but the music makes the movie so incredibly tense that you forget how dumb the actual concept is, at least for a little while. Part 2. Bad jobs, cheap thrills. Backing up a little bit, 1960s Psycho is really considered the progenitor of the jump scare as we know it. At least musically speaking, that sting at that one particular scene, you know, the iconic one, has paved the way for uses of similar ideas for good and bad purposes alike. I'm not going to delve really deep into the anatomy of a good jump scare versus a bad jump scare right here. If that's something you guys are interested in, let me know down in the comments, and while you're at it, hit the severed hand, or the other severed hand if you feel that way, and subscribe. Don't worry, we're not done yet. Anyway, before we get into what makes good horror music, we're going to get into what makes bad horror music. And to do that, we're going to have to take a little detour to The Big Bang Theory. Whether you're a fan of The Big Bang Theory or not, there's no denying that they've foie grased that show with so many excess laugh tracks that it's impossible to differentiate a random sentence from a joke. There has to be at least one joke in there somewhere, right? There has to be. The reason they do this, and the reason it works, is because part of your brain is hardwired not to be the outsider. If all of your friends are laughing at something, you're more likely to laugh at it whether or not you think it's actually funny. And to go against that takes a lot of actual conscious thought and training. Essentially, the idea and sound of human laughter is so hardwired into your lizard brain that it makes you think it's funny even if you don't think it's funny. And it creates a cycle for itself. You hear laughing, so you start laughing, and since you are laughing, if this happens often enough, your brain will start to interpret the stimulation that it is receiving as something worthy of making you laugh. Horror, particularly bad horror, tries to do the same thing with its score. They will intentionally crank the volume up on a crescendo even when nothing scary is actually happening on screen. This is done in an attempt to make your brain think that whatever is happening on screen is worthy of not only your attention, but your fear. An excellent example of this is a cheap jump scare. The film will do no work to actually build tension around the jump scare, instead relying entirely on the musical sting activating a startle response, usually going from absolute silence to very, very loud sounds. This doesn't build tension. It just startles you.
Boo!
And that's why these sorts of jump scares tend to be more frustrating than actually engaging. Or if there's just nothing happening and they still use this to try and insert fake tension into the film and create a stress response without any actual stimuli. This is something that, for example, the remake of Fantasy Island did throughout the entire film, and it was exhausting. Quick disclaimer, I'm not here to shame anyone for what you like or do not like. If you like some of the bad examples, that's fine. If you don't like some of the good examples, that's also fine. There's nothing wrong with liking bad movies, and there's nothing wrong with disliking good movies. I'm not here to tell you what you should and shouldn't like about horror, I'm just here to tell you how it works. I mean, some of my favorite horror movies are bottom of the barrel absolute trash. And I know they're bad, and that doesn't change how much I like them. And films can get some things right and other things wrong. A film can be very good at the music and very bad at everything else. Fantasy Island played high art crescendos throughout the entire film in places that they had no business being. Contrast that with It Follows, a movie with a very dumb storyline, but with a score that is so masterful that it makes every single shot of that film incredibly stressful. Part 3. Good horror music. So essentially, bad horror music doesn't build tension, is usually misplaced with the actual film, or doesn't convey the sentiment that it's trying to convey. So what makes good horror music good? So, real quick, there are a few technical musical points that give your brain the fuel to think the sounds you're hearing are scary. I am not really a technical musical person, so we're gonna kind of breeze over these, but I will link the videos that I used as sources for this video down below in case you are a more technically minded person and have an interest in more in-depth looks at the actual musical theory and structure behind that. Basically, the music theory boils down to disconcerting sounds. Much the way cinema shorthand has evolved, there's a musical shorthand. Your brain can tell when a chord sounds complete or right or wrong, and by breaking the rules of music as your brain has learned them, you are more likely to interpret the sounds as offsetting, and they are more likely to make you nervous. So, warped sounds, unfinished chords, sound and pitch bending, tones, and clusters that don't sound traditionally good to whatever style of music you grew up with. Incomplete scales, the dropping off of sounds that your ear is trained to believe will continue. All of these play a role in setting your brain's interpretation of music off balance. The blending of very high sounds and very low sounds is particularly effective in this instance. So let's talk about why. Well, it goes right back to that lizard brain. In nature, low sounds are made by bigger things, typically speaking. And to your lizard brain, bigger things are more dangerous. High-pitched sounds, particularly loud ones, for example, a violin screech sort of thing, well, that sound is particularly close to perhaps the one sound that humans have been the most biologically trained to be afraid of. A scream. Not just a scream, but, quick aside, there are different types of screams that your brain can interpret in different ways, and if you guys want a video about that, let me know in the comments because it's a lot of research, but it's fascinating. Anyway, not just a scream, but a scream of pain. Couple those two sounds in a musical score, for example, and your brain is automatically on high alert. It goes big dangerous thing, someone in pain, afraid. Tempo and pace play a big role in all of this as well. Take, for example, the Jaws theme. Pretty iconic as well, no? Here we have a sound that is extremely reminiscent of a human heartbeat. And like the way we're programmed to recognize faces wherever we could possibly see them, we're programmed to recognize human sounds, like a heartbeat. And the human brain works on mimicry for survival, so if we hear a human heartbeat, and that sound that we've equated to a heartbeat starts speeding up, what it's going to do is metabolically affect your body and cause your heartbeat to begin speeding up as it does as well. And as that speeds up, we start getting more and more stressed because that means that the threat is getting closer. Playing with speed in this particular way is super effective because slow, deep sounds are haunting, stalking, something in the bushes waiting for the moment. And fast music, particularly when it's thrown in with some high pace, it's panic, it's chaos, it's attack. Let's take a look at one of my favorite songs of all time, Hall of the Mountain King, which you might know is that one song that was in every movie commercial from 94 to 98. I know where I first heard it was on those family film collection commercials on the VHSs I had when I was little. The song starts out slow, and as it goes on, it gets faster and faster and faster, creating a stress response in the listener, which is really well used when coupled with chaotic imagery. For good horror music, we're looking for contrast, juxtaposition, sounds that actively hijack the metabolic response of the listener. Think about your favorite horror theme. Odds are it's neither slow nor fast all the way through, but sort of has a shift to it. It builds and drops and moves, and essentially what it's doing is mimicking a scenario that your lizard brain can recognize. And through this mimicry, it is hijacking your fear response. Throw in some sounds that don't really exist in nature, like the warped human voice, or whispers that you can hear but can't really understand, and not only have you summoned forth the musical equivalent of the Uncanny Valley, but you've also started to utilize the Holy Grail conditioning. Sometimes you're afraid of things just because you've been told that you should be afraid of them, or because repeated exposure has taught you that that is something to be afraid of. Take, for example, violins. Sad, tragic, frightening. The reason we have these perceptions is because your brain has seen scenes using violins that are scary or tragic or sad so many times that it starts to associate the sound you're hearing with the imagery in front of you. You hear a screeching violin enough times while someone you are watching experiences some sort of trauma or a significant event, and your brain will start to associate that sound with that trauma. The more you see something that is sad or scary while a violin is screeching away in the background, the more likely the next time you hear those violins that your brain is going to start pulling forward what you saw last time. It may just be a minuscule part of your lizard brain, but some part of your brain, when it hears that sound again, will be on the alert for tragedy or pain. There is one specific example that perfectly evokes the power of conditioning in sound, and that is the Dies Irae. The Dies Irae is a pre-14th century requiem chant that you have heard before. There's a bit of debate about who actually wrote it, but Catholic tradition states that whoever wrote it was inspired by God, so I guess we're going with the Christian God as the author. It was originally used in funerals and requiem masses, and it sounds like this. That is, it sounds like this. It sounds like this. Sounds like this. It also sounds like this. This song has been done over and over and over and over again by musicians. Even in a pre-cinema era, even in a pre-big orchestral music era, the song was used so often for death and funerals that it became the musical equivalent of the representation of death. Now, it hasn't really been used for funerals in a long time, but it's been used in film so often to represent death and tragedy, and every time your brain sees that again and again and again, the conditioning becomes more and more intense, deeper, until subconsciously, or not, when that sound plays, your brain recognizes death. Conditioning is also the key facet in one of the giants of horror musts, displacement. The idea that something that isn't really scary in one context takes on a horror perspective when it's either where it's not supposed to be or there's just something a little bit wrong about it. So in a horror film, this happens when the visual is in contrast with the audio, and it leads us directly to a much loved cheat of a lot of horror movies, the music box. Music boxes, like clowns, are completely fine in one place, but if it's coming out of your closet at 3 in the morning, and it shouldn't be in there, it rather takes on a different meaning. Music boxes, children's songs, nursery rhymes, lullabies, they're all laden with an inherent innocence and nostalgia, a seed left of childhood wonder. So really, any diversion from our expectations of such things makes it instantly terrifying. A warping of sound, so a music box that's a little too old and has started popping or creaking where it shouldn't. The addition of other sounds that have no business being in the same score as it. Or even just playing those sounds while something visual is happening in front of us that is inherently separate from the ideas that we've come to imbue in that sound gives our brain all the fuel it needs to make it terrifying. See, your brain is biologically hardwired to notice, especially when something is just a little bit wrong. It's something that has, for centuries, kept us alive, helped humans recognize when the food was a little bit off, when the thing we're looking at might not actually be what we think it is, but a predator camouflaged nearby. It is our primary, and in some cases only, tool for recognizing disease, rot, death. In a modern context, we don't really have use for that all that much, but it is still fascinating to think about how your brain and your chemistry can be completely hijacked by nothing more than a combination of sounds. Anyway, that's the video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Comment down below, let me know what you want to see next. Hit one of the severed hands. Let me know if you disliked it too, you know. Feedback is feedback. Subscribe, do the bell thing, all those YouTube things. I'm here every Wednesday, and I stream on Twitch Tuesday, Thursday, Sundays. Yes. Thanks for coming. See you next time.